Every single day, you are playing a game, whether you realize it or not, and most people go their entire lives without ever learning the rules. Napoleon Hill spent 20 years studying the men and women who won, and uncovered the rules the rest of us were never taught. This is the game of life, the rules nobody ever taught you.
My name is Napoleon Hill, and I want to begin with a fact that most people spend their entire lives refusing to accept. You are already playing. There is no version of your life in which you are sitting on the sidelines, waiting to decide whether or not you will participate. The moment you were born, you were seated at the table. The cards were dealt. The game began. I learned this lesson slowly across 20 years of studying more than 500 of the most successful men and women of my time at the request of Mr. Andrew Carnegie. I expected, when I began this work in 1908, to find that the wealthy and accomplished had simply been dealt a better hand than everyone else. Better fortune, better birth, better luck. I did not find that. What I found again and again was something far more interesting and far more useful to you. The men who won the game were not the ones holding better cards. They were the ones who understood they were at the table at all. The average man, I discovered, spends his entire life believing that the game has not yet started, that his real life is somewhere ahead of him, waiting for the right circumstances, the right amount of money, the right moment of readiness. He treats today as a rehearsal, but there is no rehearsal. There is only the game being played, whether you have picked up your cards or not. This is not a comfortable thought. I did not find it comfortable myself when it first became clear to me in the course of my research. But I want you to understand something before we go further, because it is the foundation for everything else I will tell you across this recording. The only choice available to you, the only choice that was ever available to any man or woman who has ever lived, is not whether you play. It is whether you understand the rules well enough to play well. Part 2. Your words are programming your future. There is a woman whose work I studied with great interest in my later years, Mrs. Florence Scovel Shinn, who wrote with an unusual and, I confess, startling emphasis on a single subject, the spoken word. She believed, and my own research came to support this more than I expected it would, that the words a person repeats day after day, often without noticing, are not simply describing that person's life. They are building it. I want you to think for a moment about the language you have used about yourself in just the past week. Not the language you would use in a job interview or in a moment of public confidence. I mean the language you use quietly to yourself when no one else is listening. I never have any luck. That's just how things go for me. I'll probably mess this up. Each one of these sentences, spoken casually, almost carelessly, is not a harmless observation. It is an instruction given by you to your own mind about what to expect next. In my interviews with successful men, I noticed a peculiar consistency in the language they used, even in private conversation. They did not speak about failure as a permanent condition. They spoke of it, when it came, as a temporary detour, a lesson, a setback, information. Rarely, if ever, did I hear a successful man describe himself with a fixed, defeated phrase like, "I am simply not a lucky person." What you repeatedly say, I came to understand, becomes what you repeatedly expect. And what you repeatedly expect has an uncanny way of shaping what you repeatedly notice, pursue, and ultimately receive. This is not mysticism. It is closer to habit and attention than to magic. A man who tells himself daily that opportunity never comes his way will quite naturally fail to notice the opportunity standing directly in front of him because he has trained his own mind not to look for it. So I ask you this, quite plainly, what have you been programming with the words you speak about yourself day after day for years? Part 3, the law of expectation. I want to tell you about a peculiar discovery I made, one that troubled me at first because it seemed to defy the practical, hard-headed thinking I had been raised to respect. The successful men I interviewed did not simply work harder than everyone else, though most of them did work a great deal. What set them apart, more than their effort, was the posture they held toward the future itself. Most people, in my observation, spend the greater part of their mental energy preparing for disaster. They rehearse the version of tomorrow in which the deal falls through, the illness worsens, the opportunity is given to someone else. They call this being realistic. I came to believe it is something closer to a quiet, exhausting form of self-sabotage. The men who built empires operated under a different law entirely, what I have come to call the law of expectation. They did not deny that hardship was possible. They were not fools, and neither am I asking you to be one. But they held as a kind of quiet, private conviction the expectation that life was fundamentally arranged in their favor, that circumstances, on the whole, tended to work out for them, and that setbacks, when they came, were simply the price of admission on the way to something better. I want you to notice how differently a man moves through the world when he expects things to work out for him, compared to a man who is constantly bracing for the opposite. The first man takes the risk. He makes the call. He asks the question he is afraid to ask, because some part of him expects a favorable answer, or at worst, a survivable one. The second man hesitates. He prepares only for defense, and in preparing endlessly for disaster, he very often fails to notice the door standing open right in front of him. I am not asking you to abandon caution entirely. I am asking you to consider a simple, uncomfortable question. What might change in your life if you stopped constantly rehearsing disaster and began instead quietly expecting things to work out in your favor? Part 4. Fear is a player at the table. Let us speak honestly about fear, for I encountered it in every single man I interviewed, including, I will confess to you now, in myself. Fear is not a flaw reserved for the weak or the untalented. I met men of extraordinary courage and accomplishment who privately admitted to me that fear had never once left them. What separated them from the men who failed was not the absence of fear. It was their refusal to let fear make decisions on their behalf. Here is what I came to understand about fear, after studying it closely for 2 decades. Fear causes a man to make decisions based on a future that has not yet happened, and quite often never will. Fear tells you the client will say no before you have asked the question. Fear tells you the venture will fail before the venture has even begun. Fear stages an entire performance in your mind, complete with humiliation, loss, and regret, based on events that exist nowhere except inside your own imagination. And here is the part that troubled me most in my research. Most people never notice that this is what is happening. They believe they are being practical. They believe they are protecting themselves. In truth, they are simply allowing a player at the table, an uninvited, unreliable player, to make their moves for them. I want you to picture fear, quite literally, as a seat at your own table. It has a voice, it has opinions, it is, at times, quite loud, but it does not hold the cards. You do. The successful men I studied did not defeat fear by pretending it was absent. They defeated it by refusing to let it cast the deciding vote. They felt the fear and made the call regardless. They felt the fear and signed the contract regardless. They felt the fear and moved forward anyway because they understood a rule that most people never learn. Fear is permitted to speak at your table. It is never permitted to play your hand. Part 5. Stop chasing what you think you need. I want to share with you one of the more unusual lessons that emerged from my research, one that took me many years and several disappointments of my own to fully understand. There is a particular kind of desperation that attaches itself to desire. A man decides he must have a certain job, a certain partner, a certain house, a certain outcome, and he pursues it with such singular anxious focus that the pursuit itself begins to work against him. Mrs. Shinn wrote of this with unusual clarity. She observed that what we chase with desperation very often eludes us, while what we release with a measure of trust has a curious way of finding its way toward us instead. I saw this pattern repeated in the lives of the men I interviewed. The businessman who pursued a single deal with such anxious intensity that he frightened away the very partners he needed. The young man so fixed upon a particular position that he became blind to a far better opportunity standing just beside it. I want to be careful here because I do not wish to suggest that ambition itself is the problem. Ambition, properly directed, is the very engine of achievement. I have devoted my life to studying and teaching it, but there is a difference between ambition and desperation, and it is worth learning to feel that difference in your own chest. Ambition says, I am moving toward this with everything I have, and I trust that I will land somewhere good. Desperation says, if I do not get exactly this, my life has failed. The second posture, I came to believe, closes far more doors than it opens. It narrows a man's vision so severely that he can no longer see the alternatives standing in plain view around him. So I ask you to consider honestly, is there something you have been chasing so desperately that you have lost the ability to see whether it is even the right thing for you to be chasing at all? Part 6, the law of substitution. Here is a rule I wish someone had explained to me plainly in my younger years, for it would have saved me a great deal of wasted effort. The human mind, as best as I could determine through my research, does not handle the instruction, stop thinking about something very well at all. Tell a man not to think of failure, and failure is very often the first image that appears in his mind. Mrs. Shinn understood this and offered what I consider one of her most valuable principles, what I will call, for our purposes, the law of substitution. It is not enough to simply forbid a thought. You must replace it. Instead of obsessing over the debt you fear, picture, with as much detail as you can summon, the security you are building toward. Instead of rehearsing the argument you dread having, rehearse instead the calm, resolved conversation you would prefer to have. Instead of picturing the rejection you are bracing for, picture the acceptance you are working toward. This is not idle daydreaming, and I do not offer it to you as such. In my study of successful men, I found that nearly every one of them held, with real clarity, a mental picture of the outcome they were working to create. Long before that outcome existed in the world, the mind, it seems, cannot easily hold two opposing pictures at once. And so the practical man learns to occupy his attention deliberately, rather than allowing it to drift wherever fear happens to lead it. This is not a matter of pretending your problems do not exist. It is a matter of refusing to let those problems occupy the entire space of your imagination, when that same space could instead be occupied by the outcome you are actually working to build. Whatever you do not want, do not merely try to banish it. Replace it deliberately with the picture of what you do. Part 7. Forgiveness changes the game. I want to speak now of a subject I did not expect to encounter so frequently in my research, and yet I found it again and again at the root of both remarkable success and quiet, prolonged failure, resentment. I met men of considerable talent whose progress had been halted for years, in some cases decades, because their attention remained anchored to some old grievance. A business partner who had wronged them, a father who had failed to offer approval, a rival who had, in their eyes, stolen an opportunity that rightfully belonged to them. I want to tell you something that took me a long while to accept, for it is not a comfortable truth. Holding resentment does not punish the person who wronged you. In nearly every case I studied, that person had long since moved on, often entirely unaware of the grievance still being carried against them. Resentment punishes only the one who carries it, because it keeps his attention, and therefore his creative energy, permanently anchored to the past. You cannot build a different future while you are continually reliving an old one. This is not a sentimental statement. It is, I believe, close to a mechanical fact of how the human mind operates. A mind occupied with an old injury has that much less capacity remaining for the work of building something new. Forgiveness, as I came to understand it through my research, is not primarily a gift you offer to the person who wronged you. It is the act of finally releasing your own attention from a chapter that has already closed, so that it might be redirected toward a chapter still being written. I do not ask you to forget what was done to you, nor to pretend an old wound did not occur. I ask only this. Is there some grievance you have been carrying perhaps for years that has been quietly determining how much of your own attention remains available for the life you are still trying to build? Part 8, the Law of Prosperity. Let us speak now of money, for I studied it more closely, in more lives, than almost any other subject in my 20 years of research. I want to correct at the outset a shallow and rather lazy interpretation of what I'm about to say. I am not telling you that a man may simply think about money and watch it appear in his hand. I met a great many men who thought endlessly about money and remained for their entire lives without any of it. What I found instead was something more precise and considerably more useful. Every man I interviewed carried, often without conscious awareness, a set of deeply held beliefs about money, about his own worth, and about what kinds of opportunity were available to a man like himself. And these beliefs, far more than his raw intelligence or even his effort, determined the actions he was willing to take. A man who privately believes that money is scarce, that opportunity favors other men and not himself, or that wanting more than he currently has is somehow improper or greedy. That man will, quite naturally, hesitate at the exact moments when boldness is required. He will undercharge for his work. He will decline the negotiation. He will avoid the risk that might have changed the entire course of his life. The men who built fortunes, by contrast, held a different set of private convictions. They believed that value, honestly created, deserved to be well compensated. They believed that prosperity for one man did not require poverty for another. They believed, quite simply, that they were allowed to seek more than their current circumstances suggested they deserved. So the question I ask you is not, how much do you think about money? It is this. What have you privately come to believe about your own worth and about what kind of opportunity is available to someone like you, and how much of your present behavior has been quietly shaped by that belief, without your ever examining it directly? Part 9. Stop playing the victim. I want to approach this next subject with great care, for I do not wish to be misunderstood. I met in the course of my research men and women who had suffered genuine and serious misfortune through no fault of their own: illness, war, betrayal. Circumstances no reasonable person could have anticipated or prevented. I do not intend, in what I'm about to say, to dismiss the reality of hardship that arrives through no choice of one's own. But I observed something else as well. Something I came to regard as one of the most quietly destructive patterns in human life. There is a considerable difference between a man who has suffered a genuine misfortune and a man who has come to organize his entire identity around that misfortune, using it, consciously or not, as the permanent explanation for every disappointment that follows. I met men who had experienced a single significant setback decades earlier and who were still, in their 50s and 60s, quietly attributing every subsequent failure to that one event, as though the world owed them an explanation for everything that had gone wrong since. I want to ask you a question I have come to regard as one of the most important in this entire recording, and I ask it not with judgment, but with genuine care. Where, in your own life, have you surrendered your power by believing that your circumstances, rather than your response to them, control your future? This is not a small distinction. A man who believes his circumstances have permanently determined his future has, in that very belief, handed away the one thing that was always his to keep: his response, his next decision, his next attempt. I do not ask you to pretend that what happened to you did not happen, or that it did not hurt. I ask only that you consider whether you have, perhaps without realizing it, been using an old circumstance as a permanent excuse not to make your next move. The moment you reclaim your response, however small that response may be, you have already begun to leave the position of victim and returned yourself to the position of player. Part 10. Play the game differently. We have covered a great deal of ground together, and I want, in these final moments, to bring it all to a single point. Your thoughts, your words, your expectations, your actions, your response to failure, your relationship with fear. Each of these, I came to understand across 20 years of studying the men and women who won at this game, is not a minor detail of your life. They are the rules. Most people are handed none of this. They are taught to read, to write, to calculate a sum, and then released into a game with real stakes, real consequences, and rules they were simply never given. They lose often, not because they lack talent, but because they were never told how the game was actually played. You now know something that most people around you do not. You know that your words are not simply describing your life. They are shaping it. You know that expectation, not merely effort, quietly determines what you notice and what you pursue. You know that fear is permitted to speak, but never permitted to decide. You know that what you resist deserves to be replaced, not merely denied. You know that resentment anchors you to a past you are trying to leave, and that your beliefs about your own worth are quietly directing actions you may never have examined. And you know, perhaps most importantly of all, that your circumstances do not hold the final vote. Your response does. You have been playing the game your entire life. Perhaps today isn't the day you win the game. Perhaps today is simply the day you finally learn how to play.
Before you go, if something Napoleon Hill said today landed for you, if you heard yourself somewhere in what he described, I want to ask you for one thing. Not tomorrow. Now. Hit subscribe. It costs you nothing. Not a single thing. But for us, it is everything. It helps us reach more people who need to hear these words. If today moved you, subscribe.